I'm Ben Watson from the University of Kent. I'm going to rattle you through some of the things we've been doing now. We were in a relatively fortunate position, is that we were doing some of this work before we became aware of the regulations. So we had this thing called the Opera Project. It was about learning and teaching practices and trying to make them more accessible as part of a broader student experience. And the public sector web mobile applications regulations coming along were kind of helpful for reinforcing some of that work. These steps have become quite infamous in the university, and I like showing them because I think they're a good example of what the things that we've all been talking about today. Accessible design is good design. These are steps outside our library, and this is a picture from a user experience project where we asked students to keep a diary for a week and record where they faced barriers to information. And this is a photograph taken by a visually impaired student using CAI actually, and I think we can all see the problem, right? That it's almost like an optical illusion. These are stairs, but the way the kind of there's a lack of contrast, it looks a bit hairy, doesn't it? And of course, since we've kind of highlighted this, everybody's come out and said, do you know what, I got those stairs at a funny angle, or I've nearly tripped over them loads of times. So I think this thing about, accessible design is good design is true of digital information, but it's kind of true of everything, So the situational disability stuff we heard earlier on about, the doors that open as you approach them, that's all just helpful stuff to have, Okay, so we've been doing this thing called the Opera Project, which is quite an inaccessible acronym actually. Opportunity, productivity, engagement, reducing barriers and achievement. But it was that thing about trying to identify where in the existing student journey there were problems. My background is in libraries, and for a long time I was very concerned about e-books, for example. I felt we were paying a lot of money for these services, and they weren't terribly accessible. So it kind of grew out of that, and the ultimate way I describe the work is putting in ramps and lifts to information. Everybody gets it in the physical environment, but do people understand the same, particularly academic staff who've maybe not had to face this before, because things like the Disabled Students Allowance have probably protected them from some of this. The accountability and taking responsibility for this, it perhaps wasn't on their radar, but so that's the thing. Again, we've spoken about this a lot today, but there are lots of reasons to doing this. The most important one for me is the bottom one there. It's the right thing to do. I mean, the legislation's a helpful hook, but I don't think anyone's hostile to the idea of this. What they do find difficult is time, time to absorb this as a new concept and a different way of working and changing that kind of culture. And I think that's the challenge. There's no hostility to it. So, wouldn't it be better if we just did this from the start? We were fortunate to be able to work with JISC. Alison McNaught in particular, who is a kind of legend in this area, who helped us to basically try and embed some basic JISC accessibility practices, particularly around the use of, if you design stuff to be more accessible, it's not just it passes in terms of our legal obligations, but actually it's stuff that people can then consume in different ways and have a bit more fun with in terms of the technology they can use to adapt. An accessible Word document could perform very well as an MP3, for example. A PowerPoint that has alternative text descriptions throughout it is really good for people with visual impairment, but it's also good for people who couldn't make the lecture, so that any images in that actually have a context that they wouldn't have had unless the lecture was recorded. Okay, so we've been on this journey. I think most institutions have, you'll get some disabled students and then you'll give them a kind of needs assessment where you'll develop we call it an inclusive learning plan, that outlines the sort of immediate adjustments that the university is going to make for that person. So Ben has dyslexia, therefore Ben may need a bit more time in an exam or whatever. And we wanted to get to anticipatory reasonable adjustments and then ultimately to the gold standard, of course, which is inclusive practice, because the first two are adjustments, but the first one is you got it right out of the box, you designed it well in the first place. So we designed something called Kent Inclusive Practices, which were based on an assessment of our inclusive learning plans, and said, well, what are the things that are most likely to be adjusted for? And could we zap them at source by instituting some mainstream adjustments? And these were the things we ultimately ended up with. Now, going electronic, that includes things like, trying to encourage people to publish their PowerPoint slides in advance. I think we heard earlier from Addy that if you give people the stuff in advance, then they can actually have a bit more agency to control it themselves and adapt it to their own requirements. So, so some of these things do feed in very nicely to the legislation, and these were things that we were kind of working on already. So you can see, particularly, make documents easy to navigate and understand, and make presentations meaningful, provide alternate media, but make it accessible. We were kind of already trying to familiarise people with this sort of vocabulary. So when the regulations came along, although it's still frightening because we have the same web estate problems and digital content problems and the Wild West nature of virtual learning environment creation that everyone else has, I'm hopeful that at least some of our people would have had a basic awareness of this in order that we could talk to them in a way that they would understand. I mentioned the productivity tools. This was Alistair's kind of idea that if we take the label off assistive technologies, which many of these are, and actually call them tools for productivity. So the thing we've heard about of, you know, converting a journal article into an MP3 so you can listen to it while you're on the bus or cycling up the hill to the university is a very helpful thing for someone who needs, you know, someone with a print disability, but actually it's quite helpful for everyone. And if we then start thinking about international students, part-time students, parents who perhaps, you know, are catching their learning when they can, this starts to have a bit more impact. And I think there's been an awful lot today, brilliant stuff. I've learnt loads about how institutions can create this content that's much more accessible. But I think there's a really important element as well of upskilling or embedding more confidence in your learners to be able to, even if something isn't absolutely perfect, to be able to use tools to, you know, change their experience and consume information in ways that they hadn't considered before, and not necessarily because they have a disability, actually just because that might be the way they learn best, or that particular requirement at that time suits them. We've done online training modules around inclusive learning and teaching. The first one is based on the MOOC that Southampton did, digital accessibility MOOC, but we sort of squashed it down because we were aware that our academics wouldn't do whatever a MOOC is, weeks of work over, you know, a couple of hours a week. So we said, can we kind of do the greatest hits version in an hour? And we've then done an e-learning module in partnership with Kent County Council. That was a really important thing for us. We called it the Kent Digital Inclusion Alliance, but in talking to our local council, who were in very much the same boat as us, you know, a huge web estate, you know, very devolved, we discovered that there was a lot of mileage in us sharing resources and expertise, and also just the kind of empathy and the reassurance that we're all in the same boat. So I hope we can do this on the, do we get into it? This is Kent County Council's accessibility statement, and this is the University of Kent accessibility statement. And what you should see is that, barring some things around the particular known issues that we identify and who you contact, pretty much the same. And we decided to split them by a kind of plain English version for somebody who just wants to get the best out of our website, whether they have a disability or not. And then we also did a kind of technical version, which is much more about our level of compliance and where we state, you know, the standards we're working to. But we felt by doing that was something that would hopefully make this accessibility statement not just something to cover our backs kind of legally, but it should be something that is a great opportunity to improve the general experience. Even though our website isn't perfect, I think it can be better, and we're being honest and open about how people can get a better experience from it by using some tools that perhaps they hadn't before come across. So we see that as an opportunity. Also within the alliance with the local council, we've shared procurement questions. So if you're a supplier who comes to County Hall in the morning and then down to the university in the afternoon, you're going to get exactly the same level of questioning. And hopefully, the more of us, and we've heard that today, lots of people doing that, that will start to really create a very helpful business incentive for suppliers to really take this seriously. We put on a conference, which was, we had around 200 delegates from across the public sector, but obviously mainly from local government in Kent and the university, which was super helpful. That was in June, and very, very similar to today's kind of lineup. We had Richard from GDS, and that was a really good opportunity just to get people to really start thinking about how this would apply to them. Jonathan brilliantly described the way that Edinburgh handle this, and I think our approach is relatively similar in terms of our approach to our core web estate. We were in a relatively fortunate position that we were already beginning a migration to a new web template. So knowing that was coming, we had the opportunity to really beat it up with students who were screen reader users, for example. We created some journeys through that new draft template and really went to town on, are you able to do this? Are you able to book an appointment with your tutor? Really have a good go at it. We've now got that much more accessible template, and because it's an in-house content management system, we've been able to bake in certain things. So if one of our web content editors is trying to add an image to a page, it forces them to add an alt tag and headings and stuff like that. So as much as possible, we're trying to do some nice housekeeping around kind of future-proofing that work. Although, as we all know, alternative text descriptions for images, you could easily kid that. You could easily just say picture of house, which wouldn't be terribly helpful. So the contextual stuff is then being reinforced by training and digital guidelines. We stop short of doing an actual test, but in order to get your sort of driving license to be able to have access to the new web editor, you have to have gone through that training. And there's an element of our web development team who will kind of babysit people in those early stages to kind of make sure that they're comfortable following that guidance, which was all built around user experience and inclusive design as a core set of principles. We also developed an auditing process, and again, it's very similar to Jonathan's approach at Edinburgh, where we use students in our IT consultancy to do the auditing. So they're learning all about web accessibility, which we think is a beautifully important and transferable skill, and they're helping us do our auditing. So we feel that's a win-win. And what we're doing beyond that is a dip test of our top, 500 or so web pages, like everyone else has spoken about today. We have an awful lot of web estate. We're going to try and identify the top 500 by hit rate. And then we're going to do a very extensive, we're already beginning this, an extensive bit of work about the student journey in order to help prioritise this. We're trying to look at all the interactions between the university and students on their journey from, thinking of booking an open day right through to graduation, to understand where those interactions are, what's the medium for that interaction, and actually not just digital but physical as well. So you saw our steps earlier on. We also have Blackboard Ally. I show this to show that we're not complete charlatans, that we're practicing what we preach a little bit. So this is, if not anyone's not familiar with Blackboard Ally, it lives inside Moodle, and it offers you some level of, WCAG quality assurance relating particularly to document formats, PDFs, PowerPoints, what's the other one? Word documents. We've had it for a year or so now, and we've similarly seen a gentle level of improvement. I think the great thing about something like Blackboard Ally is it allows you to reach the unreachable people. We've already heard about, you put on a session around accessibility, you get the usual suspects in the room who probably don't need to be there. What we need is directors of research and those guys who are super busy and may not always see this as something immediately relevant to them. So what Ally does is it kind of intervenes in the natural workflow. And what we've found is that we've not had to kind of set targets and say, everybody's got to get 80% or men's going to come and let your tyres down in the car park. We could get to that stage, but we're not there yet. But actually, academics seem fundamentally averse to having anything red next to their name. So there seems to be an inherent level of competition that they're enjoying, and so we're just letting that happen. I'm running out of time, and I really want to show you this. So at our conference, we had a range of speakers, much like Fiona's got today, but one of them that I think was most impactful was a student, an international law student who is blind, and he just talks about the experience of somebody in university and his life, in schooling, and he made a really lovely metaphor for what it's like. So I'm just going to play you 2 minutes of Paul speaking. I hope you can hear it. I should just say that George Rhodes from Kent County Council is also here. this was just happened to be on the screen in the conference at the time. It's a picture of black and white images of me and George, and it very much looks like one of those things in the Oscars, you know, when it's like in memoriam, people we lost this year, but we're both in rude health. Okay, so I really hope you can hear this.
That as long as one part of our society has this disadvantage and suffers from inaccessible content, that consequently also puts all other members of the society at a disadvantage. Because we may not want to hear that, but all of us are getting old at one point. Some of us will lose their vision, so we all need accessible content, and we have to stop thinking about this as being something that some 80% provide for like another like 3 people who are visually impaired in this room, but that is actually something that all of us provide for every single person who wants accessible content in the future. And if that only means for you that you can access knowledge and information faster, then that's already good. And I just thought a couple of days ago about an analogy to make it maybe a little bit more visual for you to imagine how accessibility for everyone can look like. And I come up with the idea, imagine there's like a house and it has a blocked door. When someone who can see maybe goes to that house and wants to access it, you can maybe spot a window and climb kind of like through it. But imagine if the person is blind or visually impaired or is old or just doesn't have the time to look for a window and climb through it. So they won't have the opportunity to actually access the house. And so why don't we just unblock the door? And I think that is the main message that I want to get out today. Like, unblock the door, make content accessible for everyone, not only for some people who suffer from a disability, but as a consequence also for all other people, because then, for example, websites just get, again, this interesting content that everyone can access. And don't we all want websites that not only look fancy, but are actually useful for every single one of us, and that they are the helpful tool that they should be and that they are designed to be?
Was unblock the doors of the house, let everyone get access to it. Why would we exclude anyone? And everyone wins that way. Okay. I don't know if I've got any more time, Fiona, have I? Just another, we mentioned about using students, as did Jonathan. We had a student with us who was looking at our Blackboard Ally data and trying to pick out some stories from it as part of a placement for her quantitative data analysis element she was doing for one of her modules. And when she left us, she went into a marketing and advertising job interview, and they asked her to talk about something that matters to you. And from looking at all of this data, she decided to do it on digital accessibility. And this is what she said: I was fortunate to be able to keep my quantitative research placement with Opera and help to analyse the data from Blackboard Ally and learn a lot more about web accessibility. Many people have degrees and many people have part-time work, volunteered their time and have work experience on their CV. It's time to find a new edge, and I truly believe accessibility is the new edge. She's now told us that marketing company have completely redesigned their approach and made accessibility a core part of their offer. So I think we can actually make this something that we embed into the kind of curricula as a transferable and highly, desirable skill for our students to possess. So I think that's an uncharted area for us at the moment, but something that I think IT programs, digital arts sorts of degrees should absolutely be embedding this. So with George's help from ex-County Council, which he'll explain in later on, we're exploring that. That's my contact information if you would like to contact me.
Thank you so much.